He forced her to get rid of it. She agreed. He waited at the clinic, checking his watch. But she was already gone. 8 months later, he sees her glowing and pregnant, protected by a man he could never become. Control isn't always shouted. Sometimes it's whispered like a prayer. That sentence would haunt Annie later, but on that suffocating Tuesday evening in their modest apartment, it was just another invisible chain. The acceptance letter from the design firm lay on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Lawrence sat across from her, his jaw tight, fingers drumming an impatient rhythm that made the air itself feel thin. "You're not taking that job." Not a question. Not even a discussion. A verdict delivered with the casualness of someone deciding what's for dinner. Annie's fingers trembled around her water glass. She wanted to argue, to fight, to remind him that her name was on that letter, her talent, her years of silent work in the margins of their life together. But she'd learned. Resistance only made the walls close in faster. "We've talked about this," Lawrence continued, his voice that particular kind of calm that preceded storms. "Your place is here. With me. I don't want my wife gallivanting around the city trying to impress people who'll never see you as their equal." The words landed like stones in still water. Annie didn't look up. She just spread butter on her bread, her eyes downcast, and wondered why she kept trying. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment below what you think Annie should do. They met in college. Friends said they were in love. Some even believed Lawrence was different, progressive, open-minded, the kind of white man who saw beyond color. But those who truly knew Lawrence, and perhaps he wasn't even on that list, knew he only pursued Annie because she was brilliant enough to make him look enlightened, and too kind to see the trap being built around her. The problem was that Annie loved him truly. Not in a dramatic movie-like way, but in the quiet way one loves just because. Because she didn't know how to live any other way. She loved his ambitions, his intelligence, even the sharp edges everyone else warned her about. She believed that in time, his heart would soften, that her patience would be rewarded. That love could transform control into trust. But control doesn't transform. It only tightens. 2 weeks later, Annie stared at the pregnancy test in the bathroom, 2 pink lines appearing like a verdict of their own. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a gesture of protection, of hope, of terror. When she told Lawrence that evening, his face shifted through emotions too quickly to catalog: shock, calculation, disgust, rage. Then finally, that terrible calm. "You'll take care of this," he said, the words sharp as broken glass. "We can't afford a baby right now. I won't let you trap me." Trap him. As if she were the cage. As if this life wasn't already suffocating her. As if the apartment, his name on the lease, his rules on every surface, wasn't the real prison. Annie nodded through tears. "Okay," she whispered. I'll make the appointment." But in that moment, something inside her, something she thought Lawrence had extinguished years ago, flickered back to life. Some women don't break when you try to crush them. They simply begin planning their escape. The changes came slowly, like water eroding stone. In college, Lawrence had been different, or perhaps Annie had simply been too young to recognize the signs. He'd sit in the library with her while she sketched, bringing her coffee, telling her she was going to change the world with her designs. He'd introduced her to his parents with pride, his arm around her waist like a declaration. "See? I'm not like the others. I see her brilliance." But brilliance, Annie learned, was only attractive to Lawrence when it reflected well on him. The first critique came 6 months into their marriage. Annie had bought a dress, bold, patterned, the kind that made her feel like herself. Lawrence's smile had been tight at the dinner party. Later in the car he'd said, "That dress. It's a bit much, don't you think?" You don't want people getting the wrong impression. What impression? Annie had asked. That you're trying too hard to fit in. He'd reached over, squeezed her hand. I just want to protect you. You know how people can be. The friends disappeared next, one by one, like lights going out across a city. Her college roommate, Shanice, who'd called Lawrence controlling after he'd shown up unannounced at their brunch. She's dramatic, Lawrence had said. Always stirring up trouble. You're better off without that kind of negativity. Marcus from her design program, who'd offered her a freelance opportunity. He's clearly interested in more than your work, Annie. Have some respect for our marriage. Soon, the invitations stopped coming. Or maybe Annie stopped accepting them. It was easier that way. Easier than explaining why she needed to check with Lawrence first. Easier than seeing the pity in their eyes. Her family was a different kind of distance. Her mother had never approved of Lawrence, not because of his color, but because of something she couldn't quite name. He holds you too tight, she'd said at the wedding. That's not love, baby. That's ownership. Annie had dismissed it as old-fashioned thinking, her mother's generation unable to understand a modern partnership. They spoke once a month now, conversations filled with careful silences. Annie had learned not to mention the job applications that went nowhere, the design portfolio gathering dust, the way Lawrence tracked her location on his phone for safety. Everything was in his name. The apartment lease. The car. The bank accounts. For tax purposes, Lawrence had explained, his hand on her shoulder, that reasonable voice that made her feel foolish for questioning. It's just easier this way. More efficient. You trust me, don't you? Trust had become Annie's currency, spent freely until nothing remained. To the neighbors, they were the perfect couple. Lawrence, the respectable analyst with the corner office. Annie, his beautiful wife with her warm smile and impeccable manners. At the building's holiday party, Mrs. Chen from Forby had gushed, "You two are such an inspiration. Young love thriving in this cynical world." Annie had smiled, nodded, felt Lawrence's hand at the small of her back, proprietary, guiding, inescapable. Later, she'd stood in the bathroom, staring at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman looking back. When had she learned to make herself so small? Her days became an exercise in prediction. She'd wake early, monitor Lawrence's mood over coffee. A furrowed brow meant silence was safest. A tight smile meant he'd had a bad day at work, and she should have dinner ready early. She moved through their apartment like a ghost, her presence notable only in its perfection. The immaculate kitchen, the folded laundry, the absence of anything that might displease him. At night, after Lawrence fell asleep, Annie would sometimes retrieve her old portfolio from behind the winter coats in the closet. She'd sit on the bathroom floor, flipping through sketches and concepts from another lifetime, when her hands had created freely, when her imagination hadn't learned to censor itself. One night, she was so absorbed she didn't hear the bedroom door open. "What are you doing?" Lawrence stood in the doorway, backlit by the bedroom lamp, his expression unreadable. Annie's hands fumbled, closing the portfolio, her heart hammering. Nothing. Just couldn't sleep. He crossed the bathroom in 2 steps, pulled the portfolio from her hands. Flipped through it slowly, his jaw working. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were cold. Still living in the past. These are old dreams, Annie. Time to let them go. He handed the portfolio back to her, but something in his tone felt like a warning. Like a door closing. Like the sound of a lock turning. Annie slid the portfolio back into its hiding place that night, but she didn't look away from it. Not this time. Some cages, she realized, were only as strong as your willingness to stay inside them. Annie noticed the nausea first, a rolling wave that hit her each morning before she even opened her eyes. Then came the missed period, the tenderness in her breasts, the strange metallic taste that made her morning coffee unbearable. She knew before she bought the test. Her body had already whispered the truth. She took it in the bathroom of a coffee shop 3 blocks from their apartment, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. 2 pink lines appeared almost immediately, stark and undeniable. Annie pressed her hand to her stomach, and for one unguarded moment, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated joy. A life. A person who would be half her, who she could love without conditions, without performance, without fear. Then reality crashed back. Lawrence. The apartment. The control that had slowly wrapped around her throat like a vine. The design conference had been an accident of timing. Lawrence had a business trip to Chicago, 3 days of freedom Annie hadn't known what to do with. She'd seen the flyer at the library, innovation in design, investing in tomorrow's creators, and something in her, some stubborn ember of who she used to be, had made her buy a ticket with money skimmed from grocery budgets over months. Terrence Austin had been the keynote speaker. Annie had recognized him from magazine covers. The self-made billionaire, silver-streaked hair, aviator sunglasses even indoors, the kind of commanding presence that made you sit straighter in your seat. But it was his words that had struck her, each sentence landing like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten existed. The greatest tragedy in business isn't failed ventures, he'd said, his voice carrying easily through the crowded hall. It's an overlooked talent. People with brilliant minds, working in shadows, because no one bothered to look beyond the surface. My job isn't to find the obvious stars. It's to find the ones society taught to dim their light. He'd paused, scanning the audience. If you're sitting here thinking you're not good enough, that your ideas don't matter, that you've missed your chance, you're exactly who I'm looking for. Annie had cried silently in her seat, her napkin pressed to her eyes, hoping no one noticed. When Terrence's assistant had handed out business cards afterward, Annie had tucked one into her purse like contraband. Call if you're ever serious about that design work. She'd stared at it on the bus ride home, memorizing the number before hiding it in her wallet. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now, standing in their apartment with a positive pregnancy test in her purse and dread pooling in her stomach, Annie wondered if she'd ever find the courage to make that call. Lawrence came home at 6:30, his briefcase heavy with papers, his mood impossible to read. Annie had made his favorite dinner: pot roast, roasted vegetables, everything perfectly timed. They ate in near silence, the clink of silverware marking time. "Lawrence," she said finally, her voice small, "I need to tell you something." He looked up, fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "I'm pregnant." The transformation was instant. His face cycled through shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally settled on something cold and accusatory. The fork clattered to his plate. "You did this on purpose." "What?" "No, to trap me." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is exactly what my father warned me about. You want to lock me down, saddle me with a kid, make sure I can never leave." "Lawrence, I didn't plan this. I thought she couldn't finish. Thought you'd be happy." The words felt absurd, even unspoken. "You'll take care of this." His voice was flat, final. "We can't afford a baby right now. I won't be trapped by a child I never agreed to." Annie felt the blood drain from her face. "You want me to. I want you to handle it. Like an adult. Like someone who actually thinks about consequences." He paced the small kitchen, his movements sharp with agitation. "You'll make an appointment. This week. And we'll put this behind us." "But Lawrence, maybe we could." "What, Annie?" He spun to face her, his eyes hard. Maybe we could do what? Play house? You can't even manage to keep friends, can't hold down a job, can't contribute financially to this household. And now you want to add a baby to the equation. He softened his voice, which somehow made it worse. Think about it. Where would we put it? This apartment is in my name. The car is in my name. You have, what, $200 in that little account I don't even know why you keep. He crouched beside her chair, his hand on her knee. Who would believe you could do this alone? That you'd choose this over our life together? Annie's tears fell silently, hot tracks down her face. Lawrence stood, straightened his shirt. I'm doing this for us. For our future. You'll thank me later, when we're actually ready. He kissed the top of her head, a benediction and a threat. Make an appointment tomorrow. Annie sat frozen long after he left the room, her hand pressed to her stomach, feeling the walls of her cage growing smaller, tighter, until she could barely breathe. Okay, she whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice breaking. I'll make the appointment. But beneath her tears, beneath the fear, something else stirred. Something sharp and fierce that had been sleeping too long. Annie made the clinic appointment the next morning, her voice steady as she gave the receptionist her information. Next Tuesday at 10, she repeated. Yes, I'll be there. Lawrence watched from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, nodding his approval. When she hung up, he kissed her forehead. Good girl. This is the right choice. Annie smiled, the small compliant smile she'd perfected over 3 years of marriage, and said nothing. That afternoon, while Lawrence was at work, Annie opened her laptop and logged into the bank account she'd kept from before they married. The one with her maiden name. The one Lawrence didn't know about because she'd never mentioned it, and he'd never thought to ask if any part of her existed beyond his reach. $843. Money saved from birthdays, a tax refund from her last job, a small inheritance from her grandmother. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And it was enough for a bus ticket. The phone call to Aunt Marlene took 20 minutes of pacing before Annie could make herself dial. They hadn't spoken in over a year, not since Annie had missed Marlene's birthday dinner because Lawrence had decided they had other plans at the last minute. Annie. Marlene's voice was cautious, guarded. Baby, is everything all right? Annie's throat closed. She forced herself to breathe. Aunt Marlene, I might need a place to stay. Just for a little while. Just until I figure things out. The silence stretched long enough that Annie thought the call had dropped. Does this have to do with that man you married? Annie's eyes burned. Yes. Then my door is open. You hear me? Wide open. Day or night, you come. Annie pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from sobbing. Thank you. Annie, baby, are you safe right now? Yes. I will be. I promise. That night, Annie retrieved the business card from her wallet, the edges worn soft from the number of times she touched it. Terrence Austin. She didn't call, not yet, but she took a photo of the card, saved it in her phone under a contact labeled Dr. Stevens. Lawrence checked her phone sometimes, when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The documents came next, gathered with surgical precision. Her birth certificate from the lockbox Lawrence kept in his closet. He'd filed all their important papers there, as if her very identity belonged to him. Her passport from the desk drawer. Her social security card. The deed to a small plot of land her grandmother had left her, which Lawrence had forgotten about because it had no immediate cash value. She found a hardcover book on the shelf, a dense biography Lawrence had bought to look intellectual but never read, and carefully hollowed out the center pages with a kitchen knife. The documents fit perfectly inside. She placed it back on the shelf between two other books Lawrence had never opened. With Lawrence, Annie became a performance of compliance. She spoke softly. She moved carefully. She asked what he wanted for dinner with the appropriate amount of concern. When he mentioned the appointment, she nodded and said, "Tuesday at 10. I remember." "You're handling this well," he said one evening, his hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Annie smiled and felt nothing. She packed the bag on Monday night while Lawrence worked late. One change of clothes. Underwear. Toothbrush. The hollowed-out book. A photo of her grandmother, the only family picture she kept that didn't include Lawrence. She zipped it closed and hid it behind the winter coats in the closet, pushed far back where Lawrence never looked. That night, Lawrence fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and undisturbed. He slept the way innocent people sleep, unburdened by guilt. Annie lay awake beside him, one hand resting on her stomach where nothing showed yet, where life was still a secret between her and her body. "I'll protect you," she whispered, barely audible, the words more breath than sound. "I promise. He'll never control either of us again." In the darkness, she traced small circles on her belly with her thumb, a gesture she'd seen pregnant women make, a gesture that felt like a vow. "We're leaving tomorrow. And we're never coming back." Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. A neighbor's dog barked twice, then fell silent. The city hummed with its thousand nighttime sounds, car horns, voices, the rumble of trains beneath the street. And Annie, for the first time in years, felt something she'd almost forgotten the shape of. Hope. Lawrence insisted on driving. "I want to make sure you actually go," he said, not unkindly, as if he were talking about a dentist appointment she might be tempted to skip. "We do this together." Annie nodded, her purse heavy with a hollowed-out book, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd worn comfortable shoes, Lawrence hadn't noticed, and carried only her wallet and phone. Everything else that mattered was already hidden behind the winter coats. The clinic was in a quiet part of town, a nondescript building with frosted windows and a discreet sign. Lawrence pulled into the parking lot at 9:45, 15 minutes early. He was always early for things that mattered to him. "I'll wait here," he said, killing the engine. He reached over, squeezed her hand. "Call me when it's done. I'll take you home, we'll order takeout, and tomorrow everything goes back to normal." Annie looked at him, really looked, and tried to find some trace of the man she'd thought she loved. But all she saw was someone who'd built a cage and convinced himself it was a home. "Okay," she said softly. She walked into the clinic with her head down, focusing on each step. The receptionist was kind, her voice gentle as she handed Annie a clipboard. "Just fill these out, honey. Take your time." The waiting room was quiet, populated by women at different stages of waiting. A young girl, maybe 19, sat with her mother, both of them staring at their phones in silence. An older woman read a magazine, her face composed and peaceful. A couple in the corner held hands tightly, the man's eyes red-rimmed, the woman's face turned into his shoulder. Annie filled out the paperwork with Lawrence's insurance information, signed her name at the bottom. She sat in a plastic chair and watched these women, all of them here for their own reasons, all of them deserving of choice, deserving of autonomy over their own bodies. Some looked relieved. Some looked devastated. All of them looked brave. Annie Morgan. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Annie stood, her legs somehow steady. She followed the nurse down a corridor, past examination rooms with closed doors. When they reached the restroom, Annie said, "I'm sorry, I need to." "Of course, honey. Take your time." The nurse continued down the hall. Annie slipped into the restroom, locked the door, and stood there breathing deliberately, counting to 60. Then she opened the door, checked that the hallway was clear, and walked quickly in the opposite direction. The exit sign glowed green at the end of the corridor. She pushed through the back door into an alley, into sunlight, into air that tasted like freedom. The cab driver who picked her up on the next block didn't ask questions. "Riverside Apartments," Annie said. "And please hurry." She had 20 minutes, maybe 30 before Lawrence would come looking. The apartment was empty, silent, already feeling like a place she'd only visited in a dream. Annie grabbed the hidden bag from the closet, checked that everything was there. She moved through the rooms one last time, not looking for anything, just saying goodbye to the woman who'd lived here, who'd made herself so small she'd almost disappeared entirely. On the kitchen table, Annie placed her wedding ring, the gold band that had felt increasingly like a shackle. Beside it, she left a note on the back of an envelope: "I can't. I'm sorry." She didn't apologize for leaving. She apologized for not being the possession he wanted her to be. The second cab took her to the bus station. Annie paid cash for a ticket to Atlanta, departure in 45 minutes. She sat on a bench near the gate, turned off her phone completely, and watched the minutes tick by on the departures board. At 11:30, the bus pulled out of the station. Annie pressed her forehead against the window and watched the city disappear, the skyline growing smaller, the buildings giving way to highways, to trees, to open roads. Her hand rested on her stomach, that protective gesture she was learning, that promise she was keeping. She didn't cry. There would be time for tears later. Right now, she was too busy being born. Meanwhile, across the city, Lawrence stood in their empty apartment, his phone pressed to his ear, Annie's voicemail playing for the 7th time. The apartment looked the same, everything in its place, clean and ordered, except for the ring on the table, catching afternoon light like an accusation. He saw the note. Read it once. Read it again. Then he swept everything off the table with one violent motion. Plates, mail, the ceramic bowl Annie had made in a college pottery class. He moved through the apartment like a storm, yanking open drawers, emptying closets, looking for evidence of where she'd gone. Her clothes were mostly still there. Her toiletries. But the small things, the things that mattered, were gone. Lawrence stood in the wreckage of the living room, breathing hard, his hands shaking with rage and something else he refused to name. She'd left him. His Annie. His possession. His carefully controlled world had walked out the back door of a clinic and vanished. He picked up his phone, started dialing. Friends, family, anyone who might know where she'd gone. But Annie was already gone. Already free. Already becoming someone he'd never controlled in the first place. Aunt Marlene's house in Atlanta was small and warm, filled with plants and the smell of something always cooking on the stove. She opened the door before Annie could knock, pulled her inside, and held her for a long moment without speaking. "I told you he was trouble," Marlene said finally, stepping back to look at Annie properly. "The first time I met him, I knew. The way he watched you, like you were something he owned." Annie's defenses rose automatically. "Aunt Marlene." "No." Marlene's voice was firm but not unkind. "You're here now. That's what matters. We don't have to talk about him unless you want to. But don't you dare defend him in my house." Annie's shoulders sagged. "Okay. Good. Now are you hungry?" For 3 days, Annie barely left the guest room. She slept 14 hours at a time, her body finally releasing years of tension. On the 4th day, she sat on the porch with Marlene's cat in her lap and pulled out Terrence Austin's business card. Her hand shook as she dialed. A professional voice answered on the 2nd ring. "Austin Enterprises, how may I direct your call?" I met Mr. Austin at a design conference. He gave me his card. My name is Annie Morgan." There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Ms. Morgan, Mr. Austin has you noted in his contact list. Would you like to schedule a meeting? Annie's breath caught. He'd remembered her. Yes. Please. How's Friday at 2? The Austin Enterprises building was all glass and steel, the kind of place Annie had only seen in magazines. She wore her one good dress, carried her portfolio in a leather case she'd bought years ago when she still believed in her future. The receptionist directed her to the 20th floor. Terrence's office was corner-positioned with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He stood as she entered, silver-streaked hair perfectly styled, his presence somehow both commanding and welcoming. Ms. Morgan. Thank you for coming. He gestured to a seat across from his desk. I hoped you'd call. Annie's hands trembled as she opened her portfolio. I don't know if you remember me, but... The woman who cried during my keynote. His smile was kind. I remember. Show me what you've got. She spread her designs across his desk, conceptual work, branding projects, the visual identity she developed for a fictional sustainable fashion company. Work she'd created in stolen hours, hidden in a hollowed-out book. Terrence studied each piece carefully, his expression growing more focused. Finally, he looked up. Why haven't I seen your work before? You should be running a design department somewhere. Annie's throat tightened. Personal circumstances. I had to step away. Terrence leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of attention that felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. Annie shifted, her arms crossing protectively over her middle, a gesture she didn't realize she was making. Ms. Morgan, he said gently, I'm going to ask you something, and you can tell me it's none of my business. But the way you're sitting right now, the way you jumped when my assistant knocked earlier, I've seen it before. He paused. Are you safe? The question broke something open. Annie's carefully constructed composure crumbled. I left my husband 4 days ago. He wanted me to, she couldn't finish. I couldn't do what he wanted. So I left. Terrence was quiet for a moment. My sister, he said finally, was married to a man who convinced her she was nothing without him. It took me 3 years to get her out. By the time she left, she didn't recognize herself anymore. He met Annie's eyes. I swore I'd never miss the signs again. Never stand by when I could help. I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Austin. I can work. I just need a chance. Resources. Someone to believe you're worth investing in. He pulled out a contract from his drawer. I'm offering you a position as senior designer at my firm. Salary is $75,000 to start, with full benefits. I'll advance you 2 months' salary today so you can secure housing. And if you need discreet security, I have people who can help with that. Annie stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. I don't invest in businesses, Ms. Annie. I invest in people. And you're brilliant. He slid the contract across the desk. The question is whether you're ready to invest in yourself. Tears spilled down Annie's cheeks. Mr. Austin, there's something you should know. She took a breath. I'm pregnant. About 6 weeks. That's why I left. He wanted me to terminate, and I couldn't. Terrence didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. Then we'll need to make sure your office has a mother's room. And you'll want to look at our parental leave policy. It's quite generous. Annie pressed her hands to her face, sobbing openly now. Not from sadness, but from relief so profound it felt like pain leaving her body. Welcome to Austin Enterprises, Ms. Morgan, Terrence said quietly. Let's get you started on your new life. The apartment was modest, a 1-bedroom in a safe neighborhood with good schools, hardwood floors that creaked in the morning, and windows that let in actual sunlight. Annie signed the lease with her own name, her own money, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote the first rent check. The landlord handed her 2 keys, and Annie held them in her palm like talismans. "It's all yours," the woman said, smiling. "All yours." Annie had never owned anything that was entirely hers. At Austin Enterprises, her talent unfurled like something that had been compressed too long, finally given room to breathe. The branding campaign she designed for a sustainable textile company won an industry award. The visual identity she developed for a nonprofit caught the attention of 3 major clients. By month 2, people were specifically requesting her. "Annie Morgan did the Greenweave campaign," clients would say. "We want that level of vision." Her colleagues treated her with respect that felt foreign and wonderful. No one questioned her ideas before she'd finished explaining them. No one suggested she was trying too hard or making it about herself. They simply listened, considered, and often said, "That's brilliant. Let's do it." Maya Chun worked 2 desks over, a sharp-witted designer with purple streaks in her hair and a collection of enamel pins on her jacket. She'd noticed Annie eating lunch alone for the first week and simply sat down across from her one Tuesday with 2 coffees. "You're the one everyone's talking about," Maya said. "The mysterious genius Terrence personally hired." Annie had tensed, but Maya's smile was genuine. "Don't worry. It's all good talk. Your work is incredible." They became friends the way women do when they recognize something familiar in each other, a shared understanding of having to prove themselves twice as hard. Maya was the first person Annie told about the baby, for months in, when her clothes were getting tight and she couldn't hide it much longer. "Does Lawrence know?" Maya asked carefully. Annie had told her about the escape, though not all the details. "No. And he won't." Maya squeezed her hand. "Good. That man doesn't deserve to know." Terrence handled Annie's pregnancy with the same matter-of-fact grace he handled everything. He ensured she had the best OB/GYN in the city, sent his driver to take her to appointments when she looked tired, and never once made her feel like the pregnancy was an inconvenience. His relationship with her was clearly paternal. He spoke often of his wife Catherine, showed pictures of his grown children, treated Annie with protective care that had no ulterior motive. "My daughter's about your age," he said once, looking at Annie's ultrasound photo pinned to her desk. "I hope someone would do this for her if she ever needed it." Annie attended parenting classes on Thursday evenings, sitting in a circle with other expecting mothers, learning about breathing techniques and sleep schedules and the 1,000 small ways you keep a tiny human alive. She decorated the nursery in her apartment, soft yellows and greens, a mobile with stars and moons, a rocking chair from a thrift store that Maya had helped her refinish. At night, Annie would sit in that chair, one hand on her growing belly, reading aloud from children's books. "Once upon a time," she'd begin, and the baby would kick, responding to her voice. But fear was a shadow that followed her everywhere. She checked over her shoulder constantly on the street. Jumped when men's voices rose suddenly in the office. Changed her route home every few days. Scanned crowds for Lawrence's face, that particular set of his jaw, those eyes that had watched her like property. "What if he finds me?" she asked Terrence one afternoon, her voice small. The next day, Terrence arranged a security consultation. A professional woman in a neat suit explained protective orders, safety protocols, emergency contacts. They filed the restraining order that week, legal documentation of what Lawrence had done, what he demanded, why Annie had fled. "It's just paper," Annie said, staring at the court documents. "It's evidence," Terrence corrected gently. "And evidence matters." Annie's confidence grew in increments, measured in successful presentations, in compliments from clients, in the slowly expanding wardrobe of maternity clothes she bought without asking anyone's permission. But trauma wasn't linear. Some days she felt invincible. Other days, a slammed door would send her heart racing, and she'd have to lock herself in the bathroom until she could breathe normally again. One night, 7 months pregnant, Annie stood in the nursery arranging tiny clothes. The onesies looked impossibly small in her hands. Her daughter, the ultrasound had revealed a girl, kicked vigorously against her ribs, as if impatient to meet the world. Annie sat in the rocking chair, both hands cradling her belly, and whispered into the quiet room, "We're safe now. We're going to be okay." Outside, the city hummed its evening song. Somewhere out there, Lawrence existed, probably still looking, probably still angry. But he didn't know about this apartment, this nursery, this life Annie had built from nothing. The baby kicked again, and Annie smiled. "You're going to be so loved," she whispered. "So free. Everything I'll give you, everything you'll be, he'll never touch it. Never control it. I promise." The rocking chair creaked gently as she moved. And for the first time in years, Annie felt something close to peace. Lawrence hired the private investigator 3 weeks after Annie disappeared. The man's office smelled like stale coffee and cigarettes, his desk cluttered with case files and a desktop computer from another decade. "My wife," Lawrence said, sliding a photo across the desk, "Annie at their wedding, smiling that small, careful smile. She's having some kind of breakdown. I'm worried about her safety." The investigator nodded, took notes, quoted his rates. He didn't ask why a man worried about his wife's safety had waited 3 weeks to hire help. To their mutual friends, the few they had, Lawrence performed concern beautifully. "She wasn't herself," he'd say, his voice heavy with manufactured worry. "The stress of everything, I think it broke something in her. I just want to know she's okay." People nodded sympathetically, offered to keep an eye out, said things like, "I'm sure she'll come to her senses, and she's lucky to have someone who cares so much." Alone in the apartment, Lawrence's concern dissolved into rage. He'd punch walls until his knuckles bled, throw glasses at the space where Annie used to stand, scream at the silence that had replaced her compliant voice. The humiliation consumed him, that she defied him, that she'd walked away, that she'd made him look like a fool who couldn't even control his own wife. The investigator found Aunt Marlene's address in under a week. Lawrence drove to Atlanta on a Saturday, his jaw tight with anticipation, already rehearsing what he'd say when he found Annie cowering there. Marlene answered the door in a house dress, her expression cooling the moment she recognized him. "Where is she?" Lawrence didn't bother with pleasantries. "Where's Annie?" "She's my wife. I have a right to know." Marlene stood in the doorway like a guardian, blocking his view of the interior. "She's not here." "Don't lie to me. I know she came here. I know you're hiding her." "She's not here," Marlene repeated, her voice steel. "And even if she was, I wouldn't tell you. That girl finally got smart enough to run." Lawrence's hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand. She needs help. She's not thinking clearly." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Marlene stepped forward, making Lawrence step back. "She was never yours, boy. She just got confused for a while. Mistook your cage for a home. But she's awake now. I'll call the police. Report her missing. You do that. And I'll tell them exactly why she left. About how you tried to force her into a clinic. About how you controlled every dollar, every decision, every breath she took in that apartment." Marlene's eyes were hard. "Now get off my property before I call the police myself." Lawrence drove back to his apartment in silence, his hands shaking on the wheel. Back home, the space had become a shrine to his obsession. Annie's photo on every surface. Her clothes still hanging in the closet, He couldn't bring himself to remove them. Her coffee mug unwashed in the sink, like evidence of a life interrupted. His work performance deteriorated. He missed deadlines, showed up late, snapped at colleagues. His boss pulled him aside twice with warnings he barely heard. At night, he drank whiskey straight from the bottle and searched the internet. How to find a missing person, wife disappeared with no trace, legal rights husband, runaway wife. But Annie had been careful. No credit card trail. No social media updates. No hospital records he could access. She'd vanished like smoke, and the not knowing ate at him worse than anything. The search became his purpose. Not love, he'd never loved her, not really. It was possession he mourned, control he craved. The idea that she was out there somewhere, living without his permission, thriving without his approval, it was unbearable. In Atlanta, Annie's water broke at 3 in the morning. Maya drove her to the hospital, held her hand through contractions, timed her breathing. Terrence arrived at dawn with coffee and calm reassurance, sitting in the waiting room like the father figure he'd become. Grace Morgan was born at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 6 pounds and 8 ounces of perfect, healthy baby. Annie held her daughter and wept, not from pain, but from overwhelming love and terror and relief all tangled together. "She's beautiful," Terrence said, standing at a respectful distance, his eyes damp. "Absolutely beautiful." That afternoon, flowers arrived, a tasteful arrangement with a card in Terrence's handwriting. "Welcome to the world, little one. You have an extraordinary mother." Annie sat in her hospital bed, Grace sleeping in her arms, and felt joy so intense it hurt. Her daughter. Her choice. Her life they'd built together, just the two of them. But as the sun set and the hospital settled into quiet evening rhythms, fear crept back in. Annie looked down at Grace's perfect, vulnerable face and whispered, "What if he finds us now?" The baby slept on, unbothered, innocent. But Annie couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. That somewhere out there, Lawrence was still searching. Still refusing to accept that she was gone. And he was getting closer. Grace was 6 months old when Terrence extended the invitation. Annie had returned to work part-time, bringing the baby to the office twice a week, working from home the rest. Her designs had won 2 more awards. Clients specifically requested her for their most prestigious projects. She'd become someone in the industry, not Lawrence's wife, not someone's possession, but Annie Morgan, a name that meant something. "The annual charity gala is next month," Terrence said one afternoon, leaning against her office doorframe. "I'd like you to come. Time to introduce you to the industry properly." Annie's hands stilled over her keyboard. "That's very public, Mr. Austin." "It is." He came into the office, sat in the chair across from her desk. "You can't hide forever, Annie. And you shouldn't have to. You've done nothing wrong." "He might see. Let him see." Terrence's voice was gentle but firm. "Let him see what you've become without him. Let him see that you're thriving. Sometimes the best protection is visibility, being so established, so surrounded by people who value you, that he can't touch you even if he wanted to." Annie looked at the photo on her desk, Grace laughing, her hands reaching for the camera. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." The gala was held at the Grand Ballroom downtown, all crystal chandeliers and marble floors, the kind of venue Annie had only seen in magazines. She wore an elegant emerald green dress that Maya had helped her choose, her natural hair styled in soft curls, Grace's baby bracelet tucked in her clutch for courage. Terrence arrived with his wife Catherine, introduced Annie to donors and designers and industry leaders with genuine pride. "This is Annie Morgan, our senior designer. The brilliant mind behind the Greenweave campaign." People shook her hand with respect. Asked about her process. Treated her like someone whose opinion mattered. The award presentation was Annie's idea, a grant for emerging designers from underrepresented communities. Terrence had championed it immediately, made it the centerpiece of the gala. And now Annie stood backstage, her heart pounding, preparing to walk onto that stage and speak. "You've got this," Maya whispered, squeezing her hand. The stage lights were bright and warm. Annie stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and for a moment, she was back in that apartment, making herself small, monitoring Lawrence's moods, believing she had no voice worth hearing. Then she began to speak. "Second chances aren't really about time," she said, her voice steady, carrying through the room. "They're about finding your voice after someone convinced you to be silent. They're about reclaiming the parts of yourself you were taught to hide." She paused, looked at the faces watching her, engaged, listening, present. "This grant is for every designer who was told they weren't good enough, who had to step away from their dreams, who thought their chance had passed. Your voice matters. Your vision matters. And it's never too late to begin again." The applause was genuine, sustained. Annie smiled, feeling something unlocked in her chest. Pride, maybe, or freedom, or both. She didn't see Lawrence in the audience. Didn't notice the man in the back who'd gone rigid with shock, whose face had drained of color, whose hands gripped the back of a chair so hard his knuckles went white. Lawrence had crashed the event after seeing a social media post from one of the sponsors, a photo of the guest list with Annie's name prominently featured. He'd put on his best suit, talked his way past security, and slipped into the back of the ballroom just as the speeches began. And now he watched as Annie, his Annie, stood on that stage, poised and confident and radiant. The pregnancy was over. She'd had the baby. No, she'd kept the baby. The realization crashed over him in waves. She never went through with it. She left him and kept his child. She'd been lying that entire last week planning, deceiving him while he believed she was complying. After the presentation, Lawrence watched Annie descend the stage stairs, saw her embraced by colleagues, saw the silver-haired man, the one from the photos online, Terrence Austin, the billionaire, place a protective hand on her shoulder. Lawrence moved through the crowd like a shark through water, his rage barely contained beneath his polished exterior. He caught Annie in the hallway outside the ballroom, away from the crowds, his voice low and sharp. "Annie." She turned, and Lawrence watched her face cycle through emotions. Shock, fear, then something harder. Something that looked almost like pity. "We need to talk," he said, stepping closer. "You can't just." But he never finished the sentence. Annie turned, and for a split second, fear flashed across her face. The old Annie, the one who'd learned to make herself small. Then her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and something new settled in her eyes. Before she could speak, Terrence appeared beside her, his presence commanding without being aggressive, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and respectful. "I don't believe Ms. Morgan wants to speak with you," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Lawrence's face contorted with rage. "Who the hell are you? Annie, is this why you left?" "For him." He gestured at Terrence with contempt. "You threw away our marriage for some rich." "I left," Annie interrupted, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it, "because you tried to make me destroy my child. Because you treated me like property instead of a partner. Because you confused control with love." Lawrence lunged forward, his hand reaching for Annie's arm, that old instinct to grab, to force compliance. But he never made contact. Two security officers materialized instantly, responding to Terrence's subtle signal, their hands firm on Lawrence's shoulders. "Don't touch me." Lawrence struggled against their grip. "Annie, you can't do this. You're still my wife. That's my child." "You're trespassing," Terrence said, his voice still measured but now edged with steel. And there's a protective order filed with the state of Georgia. You can leave now, or you can be removed and arrested. Your choice. The hallway had grown quiet. Guests from the gala stood watching, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips, their faces registering shock and judgment. Lawrence saw them all, colleagues, industry leaders, people whose respect he'd once craved, watching him being restrained by security, watching him unravel. "This isn't over," Lawrence hissed as the officers began escorting him toward the exit. "You can't just—" But his words faded as they pulled him away. His final glance back showed Annie standing tall beside Terrence, surrounded by people who valued her, untouchable and undeniably free. She wasn't cowering, wasn't apologizing, wasn't his. The humiliation was complete. 3 weeks later, Annie stood in her new design studio, a small but sunlit space in a converted warehouse, the walls painted cream, her name in elegant script on the frosted glass door, Annie Grace Designs. Terrence visited on a Wednesday afternoon, examining the mood boards and fabric samples spread across her work table. Grace was strapped to Annie's chest in a carrier, her tiny hands reaching for the colored pencils, cooing at the sketches. "The new collection is exceptional," Terrence said, studying a design for a modular clothing line for new mothers. "Functional, beautiful, and addresses a real need. You've got something special here, Annie." Annie adjusted Grace's sun hat, smiled. "I was thinking about something you said. About investing in people." "What about it?" "I thought I needed someone to save me," she said quietly. "But I just needed someone to believe in me while I saved myself."